Hello and welcome to my obscure little corner of the internet. Today I'd like to talk about a video put out by PragerU titled Nuclear Energy, Safe, Abundant, and Clean, presented by Michael Schellenberger, a nuclear energy advocate and author of Apocalypse Never, Why Environmental Alarmism Harms Us All. If you're lucky enough to be unfamiliar with PragerU, it is a YouTube channel funded by conservative talk radio host Dennis Prager and funded by petrochemical billionaires such as the Wilkes brothers. As you can imagine, PragerU is rife with misinformation and right-wing propaganda, though most of their content is pretty blatantly nonsense. They are known for such neuron-stimulating, high-level ideas as Latin American refugees are coming to the United States to escape government bureaucracy, feminism is debunked because any man could beat Rosie the Riveter in an arm wrestling contest, Enlightenment-era reason is bad and resulted in, literally, the Holocaust, and a personal favorite, saying happy holidays is part of a leftist plot to secularize America. With all this in mind, the perspective seemingly espoused in this video, that nuclear energy should form an integral part of environmental policy for its economic and environmental advantages, is remarkably unexpected. As you can probably tell from their source of funding, PragerU has released many videos in the past that promote climate skepticism, the advantages of fossil fuels, and the disadvantages of renewable energy. So a pro-nuclear video is pretty out of character, as, by its very existence, it seems to tacitly acknowledge the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and redirect US energy away from fossil fuels. Now, in reality, PragerU doesn't want that at all, and I'll demonstrate this at the end. Regardless of intent, I want to examine this video at face value and see if it makes a strong case in favor of nuclear power, as energy and climate policy are among the most important issues facing the world today, and there is a lot of disagreement about nuclear energy even among environmentalists. Assuming you see the need to drive down CO2 emissions by cutting fossil fuel use, which I'm just going to assume moving forward, nuclear energy does seem like an appealing option, as the process by which electricity is generated doesn't directly release CO2. And unlike solar, wind, and many other renewables, nuclear energy has been implemented at a large scale, such as in France, where nuclear is used to generate 70% of the country's electricity. Since it's the most established non-fossil fuel source of energy, it would appear that the easiest way to cut down greenhouse gas emissions is to follow the French model and go nuclear. However, you might have some reservations about nuclear energy, as some of the flashiest public health crises of the last half-century have involved nuclear power plants, such as that at 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima, the latter occurring just a decade ago. Not to mention, even setting aside the risks of a nuclear accident, having more facilities processing radioactive material in our communities cannot be good for public health. Like, what about fallout? Don't you remember how dangerous radioactivity was in fallout? Oh sure, we might decrease the greenhouse gas concentration, but is it worth simultaneously increasing the world's death claw concentration? Why are you environmentalists dodging the question? Is it because you're secretly in favor of sci-fi radiation monsters hunting red-blooded Americans for sport? Jokes aside, the obvious rebuttal to any safety concerns would be to claim that the urgency of climate change necessitates the use of nuclear energy to cut down emissions. But there are reasons to be skeptical of this claim. For instance, following the Fukushima disaster in 2011, Japan has reduced its nuclear energy from around 30% of the country's electricity in 2011 to about 6% in 2019, while at the same time reducing CO2 emissions by 100 million tons from 2010 to 2019. Given our mixed intuitions about nuclear energy and the increasingly prevalent threats that climate change poses to the world, it couldn't be more imperative that we give nuclear energy a thorough investigation to see whether it holds the key to save the climate. I'm going to go through this PragerU video examining nuclear energy on issues related to safety, cost, and environmental impact. And by the time we're done looking at this very smug Mark Schellenberger, I hope to come to a conclusion about whether nuclear is the way to go. Just before I get into this, there are a ton of super dense topics integral to nuclear energy that I'm forced to only briefly mention, such as climate change, the effects of radiation, environmental justice, workers' rights, and nuclear proliferation. All of which could be hour-plus long videos in of themselves, and knowing me, they probably will be made into hour-plus long videos in the future. I should also mention that I am not an expert. Not in nuclear physics, not in energy policy, not in anything really. This is my best attempt to make sense of this issue, and as you will see shortly, it's a pretty complicated one. If you'd like to see where I'm coming from, go ahead and take a look at my bibliography in the description. I'd particularly like to recommend What Will Work by Kristin Schrader-Frechette, as that book covers basically every topic I'm going to talk about today, and it does a better job of explaining alternatives to nuclear energy. Okay, one last disclaimer. This video is going to cover a lot of topics related to nuclear energy, but you may not be interested in all of them. So here's a list of time codes for each topic, which you can also find in the description. Without further ado, let's take a look at today's PragerU video. Schellenberger spends the most time trying to argue the safety of nuclear power, so this is where we're going to start. I'm going to play a bit of the video, and you may notice that I'm cutting around a bit, and this is because Schellenberger does this thing where he makes side remarks here and there that aren't about safety, but are instead about issues that I'm going to address later on. I promise I'm not taking them out of context. I have a link in the description if you'd like to see the whole video.
Why aren't there dozens of nuclear power plants in development all over the world? Well, we all know the answer, right? Nuclear energy is just too risky. It's too dangerous. So even though we're told we're facing an existential crisis, which means humans may cease to exist, even though we might all wither away in unbearable heat or starve because of worldwide droughts, or drown in rising seas or be killed in Mad Max-style riots, nuclear energy is off the table because it's too darn risky. I want to make sure I have this right. The goal is to save humanity. There's a way to save humanity, and we won't take it because we're afraid there might be a bad accident or something. Does that make sense to you? Because it doesn't to me. But maybe I'm not giving enough weight to the safety argument. So let's take a closer look at that.
Here, Schellenberger tries to argue that anti-nuclear environmentalists are hypocritical, since they try to argue that nuclear energy is too dangerous, despite its potential contributions towards thwarting climate change, which these same environmentalists claim to be essentially apocalyptic. In this way, safety issues associated with nuclear power are going to be weighed relative to the risks posed by climate change. So let's see Schellenberger talk about those safety issues.
Safety, like everything else, is a matter of context. So here's some context. 1.4 million people die worldwide every year in traffic accidents, 2.3 million in work-related accidents, 4.2 million from air pollution. Deaths directly related to nuclear power? Under 200. Not annually, but in the entire history of the nuclear power industry. But what about those famous nuclear disasters we've all heard so much about? Didn't they poison untold thousands? 3 Mile Island in 1979, Chernobyl in 1986, Fukushima in 2011.
So you can probably see where this is going. Schellenberger here is going to touch upon each of these 3 nuclear accidents and give a number for the death toll that is way less than you, the viewer, were expecting, and go, see, the dangers of nuclear energy are way overblown. Given that Fukushima only happened a decade ago and Chernobyl occurred in a country known for keeping its secrets, I'm going to focus on 3 Mile Island.
3 Mile Island. There was an accident at that plant, yes, but the amount of radiation that leaked was no more than one might receive taking a chest x-ray. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission acknowledged as much 4 weeks after the initial media hysteria died down. We goofed, the commission told Congress. There was no danger of any hydrogen explosion. But that didn't grab the headlines.
Okay, one quick thing. If you're a nuclear physicist, cover your ears. There are a lot of units out there that quantify radiation, and to talk about the 3 Mile Island disaster, I'm going to be using the Curie and the REM, which technically don't measure the same thing, but for the purposes of this video, I'm going to use both as units to basically just quantify the amount of radiation. So don't get confused. According to Schellenberger, the amount of radiation that leaked was no more than one might receive by taking a chest x-ray, which is wrong, very wrong, and has quite a few layers of wrongness. The chest x-ray analogy comes from the American Nuclear Society, and to read directly from the organization's page about the disaster, the average radiation dose to people living within 10 miles of the plant was 8 millirem, and no more than 100 millirem to any single individual. 8 millirem is about equal to a chest x-ray. Schellenberger seemed to imply that the total radiation given off by the disaster was equal to one chest x-ray, which would be 8 millirem. But the actual estimate from the ANS was 8 millirem per person in the area on average, with some residents experiencing doses 12 times as high. So that's already pretty dishonest on the part of PragerU, but we can go further. With a name like the American Nuclear Society, you're probably not surprised to find out the organization spends tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars per year lobbying in favor of the nuclear industry. So perhaps their characterization of the 3 Mile Island disaster is a bit biased. The chest x-ray claim is based on radiation estimated by the 1979 Presidential Kameny Report on the disaster, which would total up to 13 million curies released. This number comes from the radiation monitors present at the 3 Mile Island plant used to measure radiation releases. But the problem with the monitors was that the majority of them measured radiation past their scale. They were literally off the charts with the amount of radiation they were reading. So, when the utility that ran the plant reported the total radiation measured by their monitors, the off-scale monitors were excluded, and only the few monitors that stayed within their scale contributed toward the radiation estimate. This massively underestimated the radiation release, as dosimeters located 15 miles away from the plant detected far more radiation than would be expected from a release of 13 million curies. Based on these dosimeter readings, many scientists and physicians have subsequently produced far higher radiation estimates from 22 to 100 million curies, or 2 to 8 times higher than the Kemeny report. But some estimates are even higher, such as that of Arnold Gunderson, a nuclear engineer and former industry executive, who put the total radiation released from the plant at 1 billion curies, almost 80 times the estimate espoused by the ANS and the Kemeny report. The total radiation from the disaster is one thing, but if we're talking about the safety issues of nuclear energy, we should be asking about the public health impact of 3 Mile Island. Schellenberger makes no mention of cancer or premature deaths in this video, but the American Nuclear Society claims that there were, quote, no long-term adverse effects on the health of the population living around 3 Mile Island, unquote. On the same page as the chest x-ray analogy. In truth, the impacts of the disaster on cancer rates are still pretty controversial among scientists today. Because while cancer incidence increased in the years following the disaster, researchers disagree as to whether or not such increase was due to radiation released or the stress induced by the disaster. The stress explanation comes from a research team from Columbia University, who accepted the Kemeny report estimate of 13 million curies released, surveyed residents who had lived within 10 miles of 3 Mile Island, and used a 6-year follow-up to measure cancer data. The team found that those most theoretically susceptible to cancer from the disaster, based on radiation dose, showed no unique increase in cancer incidence. Thus, they concluded the overall increase in cancer was due to the stress of the meltdown, not radiation. However, there were a lot of problems with the Columbia research, namely that 13 million curies was an underestimate, that the weather conditions of the disaster exposed populations further than 10 miles from the plant with theoretically more radiation, and that many cancers caused by radiation have a longer latency than 6 years, and can occur as long as 10 years after the initial exposure. Additionally, the data was processed by the Columbia team using low-powered statistical tests, which are less likely to distinguish the actual effect of the radiation from the random noise inherent in the data. In fact, a team at the University of North Carolina used the same 3 flawed assumptions with higher-powered statistical methods and came to the opposite conclusion, that radiation released by the plant did significantly increase cancer among those within 10 miles of the plant, especially leukemia, one of the cancers most sensitive to radiation. If I'm being completely honest, the debate between whether the increase in cancer was due to stress or radiation, though interesting, is a bit irrelevant to what we're trying to discuss today. After all, if you lived in the area of 3 Mile Island and you were dying from cancer as a result, I don't think you'd particularly care whether the cancer came from radiation or stress. If we're asking about the safety of nuclear energy, the fact that the disaster caused cancer is all we really need to know. Also, the thing about the risk of a hydrogen explosion is a total red herring. The primary health concern of the 3 Mile Island disaster has always been the radiation exposure. To sum up, Schellenberger's description of the 3 Mile Island disaster includes a misleading summary about the Kemeny report radiation estimate, which itself is an underestimate by a factor of 2 to 80, a red herring about a hydrogen explosion, and no mention of the increase in cancer incidence that occurred in the aftermath of the disaster. I'm sure you will be utterly flabbergasted to find out that Schellenberger is also pretty dishonest in his characterization of Chernobyl and Fukushima. He cites the World Health Organization in saying that fewer than 50 deaths had been attributed to Chernobyl, but neglects to mention that the same WHO press release, from which that quote originates, an ultimate death toll of 4,000 was projected. That 4,000 figure, by the way, is a low estimate, with other projections as high as 60,000 deaths.
Deaths directly related to nuclear power? Under 200. Not annually, but in the entire history of the nuclear power industry.
Under 200.
As for Fukushima, Schellenberger claims no one died from radiation and that all deaths were directly attributable to the tsunami. However, the World Health Organization notes that one person was confirmed to die from the radiation and another 573 from evacuation stress. So again, pretty dishonest. It should also be noted that since Fukushima only happened a decade ago, the full public health impact of the disaster will remain unknown for many decades to come. Now, what I just did, talking about nuclear safety specifically with reference to accidents and disasters, already cedes a lot of ground to the pro-nuclear position, as nuclear accidents are relatively infrequent and death tolls often have wide ranges of uncertainty. Nuclear advocates don't often bring up the public health issues related to the routine functions in nuclear plants, even though the mere presence of a nuclear power plant undoubtedly increases the radioactive exposure to those that live nearby, with or without a major disaster. Schellenberger only brings up one of these issues, that of nuclear waste, but grievously oversimplifies the problem.
Well, what about the nuclear waste? Surely that's terribly harmful. Actually, no. All the nuclear waste ever generated in the US can fit on a single football field stacked less than 70 feet high. It's easily and safely buried in steel canisters encased in concrete.
Alright, we gotta take a quick field trip for this one. Everyone, pile onto the bus.
Please let this be a normal field trip. With the frizz? No way!
Nuclear fuel doesn't look like the green glowing goop you might see on TV, but rather it comes in solid rods of metal that contain uranium. When a rod is spent, it's placed into a pool of water known as a spent fuel pool to keep it cool, often for 2 to 5 years until the fuel is stable enough for a dry cask, which is the thing made of steel and concrete that Schellenberger brought up. However, dry casks are absolutely enormous, often more than 100 tons, and thus take up a lot of space at nuclear facilities. How much space? Well, a heck of a lot more than a football field stacked 7 yards high, as that statistic only accounts for the combined volume of the nuclear fuel alone, not the absolute unitness of the dry casks that the fuel is stored inside. To save space, many nuclear plant owners keep spent fuel in the pools longer than is necessary. The problem here is that these spent fuel pools are getting crowded, and many plants have had to expand the volume and circulation of their fuel pools to keep the growing number of fuel rods from overheating. These overcrowded pools have created a rather dangerous situation, as a malfunction in the cooling system of the pool could result in the rods overheating and catching fire, which has the potential to release devastatingly large amounts of radioactive particles, as uranium fires have historically done. Such precarity also increases the threat of terrorism, which I'll address later. The obvious solution is to have an off-site location for all US plants to store their dry casks, in order to lighten the load of fuel rods in their pools. However, the US doesn't currently have such a location. For decades, Yucca Mountain in Nevada was supposed to be the long-term site for nuclear waste disposal, but legal challenges and local opposition resulted in the proposed facility being scrapped. Without the long-term storage site, nuclear plant owners are disincentivized from moving spent fuel into dry casks, and thus the fuel continues to accumulate in the spent fuel pools. Oh, and even if we have a long-term storage site, the risks of nuclear waste do not end there, as spent fuel will continue to be radioactive for millions of years. Whatever facility we could conceivably construct would thus need to be ready to store such waste for that duration. And on such timescales, it's basically inevitable that nuclear waste will leak from their containment facilities and contaminate groundwater. The longevity of spent nuclear fuel means that there is nowhere we can put it that won't prevent radioactive particles from escaping. Besides nuclear waste, nuclear plants routinely release radioactive isotopes into the local atmosphere and groundwater, which Schellenberger conveniently forgets to mention. The U.S. Department of Energy allows individuals and the public to be exposed to 100 millirems of radiation from nuclear plants annually, which is relatively low compared to the average background radiation that Americans receive annually of 620 millirems from sources such as ultraviolet light from the sun, to radioluminescent exit signs, to naturally radioactive potassium in bananas. However, there is no such thing as a safe dose of radiation, and any exposure has a cumulative effect over the course of one's life, making any exposure a potential contribution to future cancer and premature death. I'm not going to get too far into this at the moment, but the routine radiation emissions of nuclear plants have had a measurable effect on the public health of radiation workers and children, as well as more broadly in Black and Native American communities where nuclear facilities disproportionately locate themselves. While we're on the topic of hazards that Schellenberger neglects to admit, let's talk about nuclear proliferation and terrorism. Because without putting too fine a point on it, if we're bombed back to the Stone Age, that'll kind of defeat the purpose of avoiding climate change. Fun fact, after the Second World War, the governments of the United States, United Kingdom, and Soviet Union all began seriously investing in nuclear electrical utilities in order to have a non-military reason for producing weapons-grade uranium and plutonium for their respective nuclear arsenals. This link between commercial and military use of nuclear technology is present in many other countries as well. For example, both India and Pakistan developed their nuclear arsenals from commercial reactors that were built by American and Canadian companies. Historically, widespread use of nuclear energy has led to widespread development of nuclear weaponry, which is pretty scary to say the least. Even if you're under the impression that quote-unquote Western democratic countries can be trusted to increase their use of nuclear energy without secretly increasing their nuclear arsenals, power plants need to be placed all over the world if we're implementing nuclear energy as a solution to climate change. So take a look at this map and ask yourself, do you trust every single country to use nuclear energy without making nuclear war a near certainty? We need to trust more than just the 200 or so governments of the world to use nuclear energy as well, as the risk of non-state terrorism is arguably even greater. Though nuclear facilities are often heavily guarded here in the United States, plants in other countries are often less secure. Historically, there have been attempts by terrorist groups to buy weapons-grade uranium from Russian nuclear plants, for example. If we embrace nuclear energy to ward off climate change, terrorist groups will have a far greater ease in obtaining radioactive materials to cause a devastating amount of harm, as plants are placed all across the world. Even if we were to make nuclear energy plants as secure as they possibly could be, the truth is that a terrorist group only needs to succeed in infiltrating the facility once, while the security forces need to succeed every time. So, to recap Schellenberger's explanation of the safety issues of nuclear energy, he defines the problem entirely by nuclear accidents and nuclear waste, with liberal use of lies and oversimplifications, without mention of more pressing and less easily justified risks of routine radiation emissions, nuclear proliferation, and nuclear terrorism. I think he said it best himself.
But maybe I'm not giving enough weight to the safety argument.
Yeah, Mike, maybe not. For now, let's generously set aside the issue of safety and address the more pressing issue, whether nuclear energy is a miraculous panacea to the climate crisis.
Nuclear energy is not only cleaner than all other forms of energy, it's also cheaper to create, abundant, and safe.
Is that it? Is that all he has to say about the advantages of nuclear energy? Just kinda assuming nuclear energy is uncontroversially clean and efficient without further clarification? Oh, wait, yes. That's exactly what he does.
No one, not even the most radical environmentalist, disputes that nuclear power produces massive amounts of energy cleanly and efficiently.
Oh boy. NBs, ladies, gentlemen, are you ready to go where no, radical environmentalist has gone before? Are you ready to dispute the apparently universal axiom that nuclear good at energy? Alright, so I'm going to have to take a brief detour and talk about what a nuclear reactor actually does. Within a nuclear reactor, atoms of uranium undergo what is known as a fission reaction. Now, if we remember from high school chemistry, the nucleus of an atom is composed of protons and neutrons, and atoms with the same number of protons but different numbers of neutrons are known as isotopes. Nuclear fission involves splitting the nucleus of uranium-235, a particular isotope, with a neutron, which then produces more free neutrons which proceed to split subsequent uranium-235 nuclei. Crucially, energy is emitted when the nucleus is split, and this energy is harnessed in nuclear reactors to evaporate water to produce steam, which turns a turbine which generates electricity. From this brief explanation, you're probably under the impression that nuclear doesn't produce much greenhouse gases, as CO2 doesn't seem to be involved at any step. However, this isn't the full story. The part where fission takes place is only one of 14 steps in the nuclear fuel cycle, which starts at mining uranium ore to processing and enriching the uranium to produce fuel, to building the reactor, all the way through storing waste and decommissioning. Many steps in this cycle actually consume electricity, particularly when transforming uranium ore into nuclear fuel. And since 60% of US electricity comes from fossil fuels, such steps in the cycle therefore emit CO2. Not to mention all the fossil fuels burned to pour the concrete and produce the steel needed to build the reactor and dry casks, as well as for the transportation that needs to take place between all these steps. Even during the operation of a reactor, where uranium undergoes fission to produce electricity, like I showed you earlier, a rather significant amount of CO2 is emitted, as the same fossil fuel-generated electricity is used for maintenance, cooling systems, and backup generators. Because of the heavy electricity requirements at the beginning of the fuel cycle, some scientists, such as Jan Willem Storm van Leeuwen, have claimed that nuclear plants actually operate at an electricity deficit, and only after 11 years of operation can a plant generate the same electricity that it has consumed. However, Storm van Leeuwen's work is fairly controversial, and many of his anti-nuclear claims have earned a fair bit of criticism. The point still stands that nuclear energy is not quite as efficient as Schellenberger appears to imply. So how do the CO2 emissions of nuclear power compare to other sources of electricity? According to a meta-analysis performed by Benjamin Sovacool of the University of Singapore, nuclear power on average produces 66 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour of electricity generated, as compared to 9 and 32 grams for wind and solar voltaic, while fossil fuels like natural gas and coal have emissions of 443 and 1,010 grams respectively. Based on this study, nuclear power emits significantly less CO2 per unit of energy than fossil fuels. But the nuclear fuel cycle still emits more than twice the CO2 of solar power and 7 times the CO2 of wind power. However, things aren't quite as cut and dry as they might seem. Sovacool admits that for each stage of the nuclear fuel cycle, the CO2 emissions vary considerably from study to study. And when you add together the lowest and all the highest estimates for each stage, you get a range from 1.4 to 288 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. There's a lot that explains such variations, such as different technologies which have different energy efficiencies. For example, at the uranium enrichment stage of the fuel cycle, it makes a difference in energy consumption whether a plant uses the gaseous diffusion method versus the gaseous centrifuge method. There are also more, shall we say, cynical reasons for the variation in CO2 emissions. Many studies that aim to measure the carbon emissions of nuclear power are often directly funded by the nuclear industry or originate from a government agency or other organization that's heavily influenced by the industry. A lot of these studies are often given flawed data, or they neglect numerous stages in the nuclear fuel cycle and arrive at underestimates for nuclear energy's total CO2 emissions. There are flawed studies on the other direction as well, as 3 of the 19 studies used to calculate that 66-gram average we saw before were authored by Storm van Leeuwen, and each of the calculated emissions from those studies are definitely on the high end. However, I consider the 66 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour calculation to be fairly reliable, as similar meta-analyses have produced a similar value, such as that of Manfred Lenzen of the University of Sydney, who calculated 65 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. Lenzen's study is considered to be particularly reliable, as it was one of 2 nuclear emission studies cited by the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for its figures comparing CO2 emissions from different energy sources. Wait, hold on. The IPCC report seems to be claiming that nuclear power generates an average of 12 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, but we just read that their source, Lenzen, found that nuclear power emits 65 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. Oh, okay, I see the difference. The IPCC is reporting the median, or the middle-ranked value of the dataset, while Lenzen used the mean. The median is somewhat of a weird measure to use, since, as I mentioned before, some studies used in Lenzen and Sovacool's analyses leave out entire steps of the nuclear cycle, sometimes to intentionally underestimate the CO2 emissions, but also because some studies only aim to estimate the emissions of particular steps rather than the entire cycle. This explanation is going to rely on some visuals, so if you're just listening along, now would be a good time to look at the screen. These omitted steps in the fuel cycle don't affect much when you're looking at the mean, as both Lenzen and Sovacool looked at the estimates of each individual study at the different stages in the fuel cycle and averaged the published estimates for each stage, before adding them together to arrive at their estimate for the entire cycle. If you're looking at the median, however, you first need to find the total CO2 emissions for the entire cycle estimated by each individual study. Crucially, this changes the emissions to 0 for stages in the cycle that a study doesn't estimate, while if we're looking at the mean, those stages would simply be no input and wouldn't affect anything. Perhaps you can see how looking at the median can make CO2 emissions deceptively low for nuclear. You may have noticed that the CO2 emissions for wind power are the same as nuclear in the IPCC table, even though Sovacool's numbers indicated that nuclear had 7 times as much CO2 emissions. That's because when you check the main source for the wind power median, Arvidsson and Hertwich, you find that their study calculated a mean as 16 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, which isn't a median. This calculation was apparently checked against the estimates of 2 other sources, but of those sources, one did calculate a median from a meta-analysis at 12 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. From each of these estimates, it clearly isn't as problematic to use the median estimate with wind power as it is for nuclear, since the mean and median estimates basically agree for wind power. Thus, I think it's fair to say that the IPCC's choice to use median estimates makes nuclear look cleaner than it really is, by erroneously claiming that wind power has the same emissions. Any way you slice it, the IPCC's numbers are pretty suspect.
Cut. I'm sorry, but could you repeat that last line?
Yeah, sure. Any way you slice it, the IPCC's numbers are pretty suspect. So, is nuclear clean? Not really. And assuming you want to tackle climate change and use energy sources other than fossil fuels, it's obvious that nuclear is not the best choice by a long shot. Alright, confession time. When I said earlier that Schellenberger doesn't offer any sort of defense or explanation for why nuclear is efficient, I wasn't totally telling the truth, as Schellenberger briefly argues one specific advantage of nuclear energy, that of land use. I figure while I'm on the topic of the environmental cost of nuclear energy, I might as well address this now. To provide context for this clip, Schellenberger is talking about the legal challenges that our poor widow precious nuclear industry has to suffer by big, mean environmentalists.
Ironically, one of the anti-nuclear groups that now litigates against nuclear energy, the Sierra Club, was once a great proponent. The legendary early leader of the club, Will Seary, saw it as the best chance to preserve wildlife. Cheap nuclear power in unlimited quantities is one of the chief factors in allowing a large, rapidly growing population to preserve wildlands, open space, and lands of high scenic value, he told the club in 1966. He was right then, and he's right now. It would take dozens of wind and solar farms covering thousands of acres of land to match the energy a single nuclear power plant can produce.
Finally, we have a specific claim to examine, but we have another red herring. If we wanted to supply 1/3 of the electricity in the United States using solar power, we'd need 11,000 square kilometers of land. If we wanted to do the same with wind power, we'd need 66,000 square kilometers. As for nuclear energy, we currently devote 4,800 square kilometers to power plants, and since nuclear energy provides roughly 20% of the electricity in the United States, we can do an admittedly crude calculation to find that we'd need roughly 8,000 square kilometers to provide 1/3 of US electricity with nuclear power. Nuclear is obviously far more land intensive than either solar or wind power, but these aren't exactly apples to apples comparisons. The main difference between a nuclear power plant versus solar panels or wind turbines is that land used for a power plant can only be used for that purpose, while solar panels can go on rooftops and parking lots, and wind turbines can be placed in land that is still used for grazing and agriculture. Additionally, if we're really concerned about space, the US currently devotes about 66,000 square kilometers to growing corn for ethanol production to go into gasoline, and 9,000 square kilometers to golf courses. So yes, renewables use a lot of land, but if we're smart about it, we can both increase our use of solar and wind without having to flatten that many forests to do so, like Schellenberger thinks we would. Okay, let's move on and talk about cost, as Schellenberger seems to find the cost efficiency of nuclear to be unquestionable. Say you just watched PragerU's video and decided to verify whether nuclear is actually cheap relative to other energy sources. How would you go about doing that? Well, you'd probably hop onto your search engine of choice and input something like cost of different energy sources. You would probably scroll past that infuriating greenwashing ad from Exxon and click onto everyone's favorite source for fast facts, Wikipedia, on an article titled Cost of Electricity by Source. Then obviously you'd scroll past all that text. Ugh, those unindented paragraphs really make the eyes glaze over. But then your lizard brain would inevitably make you stop at that colorful graph, making you notice that table underneath, which appears to have all the information you were looking for. Wikipedia only shows 3 sources that have the cost for nuclear, renewables, and fossil fuels. the Nuclear Energy Agency, the IPCC, and Lazard. The NEA and IPCC values seem to agree with one another for the most part, and you can see on the graph that the Lazard estimate for the cost of nuclear energy is clearly the outlier, so you'll just exclude Lazard. Well, Schellenberger seems to be correct. You therefore conclude nuclear power is one of the cheapest options for electricity at $55 to $60 per megawatt hour. Or is he? As a matter of fact, these numbers don't tell the whole story, and both the IPCC and NEA are being a bit misleading with their estimations, though I may have ruined the suspense a bit earlier when I criticized the IPCC greenhouse gas numbers. Linked to the Wikipedia page is an annex from an IPCC report which contains a table with all of the information cited in the Wikipedia article. We can see in the footnote for the nuclear data that the costs include the entire fuel cycle, which is good, and a 2010 joint report by the NEA and the International Energy Agency provides the information on the methodology of the fuel cycle cost estimations. Just to be clear, the NEA source cited in the IPCC report is different from the NEA source cited in the Wikipedia page, but I'm going to focus on the 2010 report cited by the IPCC, as it should give us a good overall impression of how the NEA calculates nuclear costs. When looking at the NEA guidelines for calculating levelized cost of electricity, or LCOE, which is the metric we were looking at on the Wikipedia and the IPCC report, I found 5 assumptions which cut the cost on nuclear energy. In the interests of time, as if this video isn't already super long, I'll run through each of these quickly. I'm going to be using some calculations to estimate the degree each of these assumptions underestimates the cost of nuclear power. Please do yourself a favor and take these calculations with the smallest grain of salt. It is very likely that my calculations are flawed in some way obvious to someone who costs nuclear energy for a living. I'm only doing this to give some impression of the degree that these numbers trim the true cost. First, the NEA assumes that a nuclear reactor will have a lifespan of 60 years, despite the fact that the global average age of a reactor is 22 years, and most reactors in the United States were built to last 30 years. According to Kristin Schrader-Frechette in What Will Work, a reactor that lasts 22 years has a levelized cost 5% higher than one that lasts for 40 years. If we assume a linear relationship between levelized cost and total reactor lifetime, with construction and decommission costs remaining constant while the annual profit per megawatt hour is roughly equal for the entire duration, then assuming the average lifetime of a reactor to be 60 years decreases the levelized cost by 10.6% compared to the 22-year average.
In order to correct for this, the 60-year levelized cost would need to increase by 11.9%.
Second, the NEA estimates the average construction time of a nuclear plant to be 7 years, while the average construction time for a plant globally in 2019 was 10 years. And by the way, the average in the United States is 12 years. Again, according to Schrader-Frechette, for every additional 5 years of construction time for a nuclear plant, the cost increases by 75%, which means that the actual levelized cost is 45% higher than the one given by the NEA, given the 3-year difference between the estimated construction time and the actual average construction time. Third, the NEA assumes an average load factor of 85%. The load factor of a nuclear reactor is the ratio between the actual generated electricity versus the maximum possible output. The International Atomic Energy Agency, a UN organization, puts the average nuclear plant at 76.4% load factor. According to an MIT study of nuclear cost, for each 1% decrease in load factor, the levelized cost increases by 1 to 1.5%. I'll take the middle of this range and say that levelized cost increases by 1.25 for every 1% decrease in load factor, which means that the 8.6% decrease from the NEA estimated load factor to the IAEA average load factor results in a 10.75 increase in levelized cost. Fourth, the NEA only calculates the levelized cost for specific generations of nuclear reactors. Of particular note, the levelized cost of the United States nuclear energy is based entirely off of Generation 3 plus nuclear reactors. And get this, there are no Generation 3 reactors, plus or otherwise, currently operating in the United States. There are some Generation 3 plus reactors, specifically of the model AP1000 that the US is planning on building, but those reactors certainly would not inform the levelized cost in 2010, when the report was published. I don't have a particular calculation for how much the use of Generation 3 plus reactors affected the overall levelized cost, but considering the US has a plurality of nuclear reactors, as well as the supposed economic competitiveness of AP1000 reactors, it's still worth bringing up. Fifth, and most importantly in my opinion, the IPCC does not account for energy subsidies in its cost estimates. If you look at the US alone, $120 billion of taxpayer money was spent in total on direct subsidies for nuclear, solar, and wind power between 1943 and 1999. More than 95% of that money going just to the nuclear industry, so roughly $2.05 billion per year. Perhaps you can already see how neglecting subsidies in the levelized cost calculations biases them in favor of nuclear energy at the expense of renewables. This is just in federal subsidies, by the way, which doesn't include the money granted by nuclear-heavy states such as Illinois, New York, and New Jersey, which reduces the cost of nuclear energy to utilities even further. Again, I don't have a calculation to determine how much these subsidies would affect the levelized cost in the IPCC report, but you can see how leaving out subsidies neglects a significant amount of taxpayer money that helps keep the nuclear industry afloat. But if we're talking about indirect subsidies, I do have a theoretical calculation to correct the levelized cost. The main indirect subsidy offered to the nuclear industry is limited liability for accidents, which in the US limits the liability of power plant operators to $10.8 billion in the case of a nuclear accident. The worst case scenario for a nuclear accident would involve approximately $660 billion, making the $10.8 billion only 1.5% of the total damages, with the remaining 98.5% of the damages paid for by the victims of the accident. Outside the US, nuclear utilities have even less liability, with the financial burden of a disaster either falling on the taxpayers or the disaster victims. According to the European Commission and the World Nuclear Association, if nuclear plant operators had to buy private, full liability insurance, the costs of nuclear energy would triple, which would make the industry way too costly and risky to compete in today's economy. So basically, the nuclear industry depends on the victims to bear the financial burdens of nuclear accidents to stay afloat. And just to be clear, such financial burdens do not factor into the levelized cost published by the IPCC.
So if we're just correcting for the inflated reactor times, underestimated construction times, and overestimated load factors, the levelized cost of electricity for nuclear power would increase by 67.65% to about $109 per megawatt hour, which is already quite the difference. I should note that this estimate is pretty similar to the levelized cost estimate often cited by nuclear executives at industry conferences and summits. If we were to include the costs of indirect subsidies in the form of limited accident liability, the levelized cost would increase by 267.65% to roughly $239 per megawatt hour.
And again, this isn't including the inaccurate generation assumptions nor the direct subsidies. So, is nuclear energy cheap? Only if you make a bunch of wrong assumptions and neglect the cost to the taxpayer and disaster victim. Because of the high costs of nuclear, no power plants have ever been built without massive government intervention, including in France, where, if you remember, 70% of the electricity is generated by nuclear power. The French nuclear industry is clearly not the model to follow, as it's basically state-owned, and their power plants were never intended to be a profitable source of energy, but rather an attempt at energy independence after the 1973 oil crisis. I'm not trying to be an anarcho-capitalist and say that government intervention bad, but the failure of the nuclear industry to compete in the free market is a good representation of the economic inefficiency inherent in nuclear power. Now, I can go off on a whole nother tangent talking about why the renewable energy costs on the IPCC report are inflated due to overemphasized storage and intermittency, but I think you're done hearing about cost calculations, and I know for a fact I am done talking about them, so I'm going to move on. Alright, final claim to examine. Are nuclear fuel inputs abundant? Well, this one's a bit tough to answer. Like coal and natural gas, the amount of uranium on Earth is finite, which means that nuclear fission is ultimately a non-renewable form of energy. The primary mineral that is mined for electricity generation is known as yellowcake uranium oxide, and ore is generally only mined if its yellowcake composition is above 0.1%. And it's pretty controversial how much of this higher grade 0.1% ore is readily mineable. So how much do we have left on Earth, and when will we run out? Well, we don't know. The theory that we are about to tap our uranium stores is called peak uranium, where the amount of uranium ore that is extracted every year globally increases as energy demand increases, but eventually peaks and starts to decline as the most easily exploitable ore is depleted. On a smaller scale, peak uranium has seemingly already occurred in Europe, the United States, and South Africa. And on a global scale, uranium ore production looks as if it has started to slow around 55 to 60,000 tons of uranium. As for how long we have left before the high-grade ore completely runs out, our controversial friend Jan Willem Storm van Leeuwen predicts that such a point will come as soon as 2034. On the other hand, there are plenty of other experts that claim that we will reliably have yellowcake ore at least as far out as we can reasonably predict. The point is, the amount of usable yellowcake ore is still hotly debated. Yellowcake stocks have been indicating signs of long-term shortages, however, according to BOFA. What is BOFA, you ask? So what happens when we run out of yellowcake? In truth, there are trace amounts of uranium in granite and seawater, which are theoretically usable for nuclear fission, but the technology really isn't there to extract that uranium efficiently. According to David Fleming, the author of The Lean Guide to Nuclear Energy, once we resort to using uranium oxide ore below 0.02% composition, the amount of electricity that it will take to convert the ore into nuclear fuel will be greater than or equal than the amount of electricity the fuel will produce. In other words, nuclear power would reach electric bankruptcy and be ultimately self-defeating. There are significant secondary sources of uranium that could be tapped once we run out of yellowcake ore, however, such as reprocessed nuclear waste or decommissioned nuclear weapons. The problem with using these secondary sources is that they aren't guaranteed to be economical to reprocess, as expensive, specialized equipment is necessary to produce usable nuclear fuel. Additionally, reprocessing nuclear waste, specifically, may heighten concerns of terrorism and proliferation, as recycling fuel makes it harder to keep track of all the radioactive materials used, reused, and not used yet, which could result in material being more easily stolen by a terrorist group or intentionally overlooked by a government with a nefarious agenda. So, is uranium abundant enough to be a reliable source of fuel? I would say it's inconclusive, though one may conclude either yes or no and have a group of experts that agree. With what we know about the safety, the economics, and the environmental issues associated with nuclear, let's take a brief moment to talk about what a pro-nuclear energy policy would look like. If you're absolutely bonkers, you might propose we have 6,000 nuclear plants by 2050 to fulfill 100% of energy use. For reference, there are only 440 operational nuclear reactors currently, so we're talking about a 13-fold increase in production. The feasibility of this is laughable, especially with the problems with cost and uranium abundance mentioned earlier. One good indicator of the feasibility of this now is to look at some of its short-term goals. This article was written in 2005, and it said that we would need to build 30 new reactors per year between 2010 and 2020 for a total of 300 new reactors, which, by the way, is the least ambitious rate for a single decade. Do you want to know how many nuclear reactors were built between 2010 and 2020? 63, mostly in Asia. About 20% of that goal. Do you want to hear something funny, though? During the same decade, the total number of decommissioned reactors was 62. Mostly in Europe and Japan. So we have had a net increase of 1 reactor during the entire decade. Way to go. A slightly more realistic nuclear plan is that of nuclear tripling, or increasing our nuclear capacity threefold to a total of 1,000 to 1,500 reactors by 2050. According to industry leaders and pro-nuclear academics, this is about as ambitious of a nuclear plan that we could have, and it still requires building at least 600 nuclear reactors in less than 30 years. If we were to accomplish this, we'd be generating about 20% of global electricity using nuclear, an increase from 10.8% of today's electric generation. Now, if you remember back about 6 script pages ago, I mentioned that much of nuclear CO2 emissions comes from electricity generated from fossil fuels. Now, you may have been thinking at the time something like,
But if we increase our nuclear capacity, more of that electricity used by nuclear plants would be generated by other nuclear plants, therefore decreasing overall nuclear carbon emissions.
Even though it took a while, I hope I responded to your objection. The most ambitious nuclear plan that is still somewhat feasible would still only have 20% of global electricity generated from nuclear power plants by 2050, which, by the way, is the deadline for us to be carbon neutral. According to a broadly pro-nuclear MIT study, if we didn't do anything to address climate change, CO2 emissions would be 200% greater than they were in 2003 in 2050. If we build 1,000 more nuclear reactors, CO2 emissions would be 175% greater. Based on everything we've talked about, from the legitimate concerns about radiation and nuclear war, to the high CO2 emissions relative to other low-carbon energy sources, to the high cost to the taxpayer and electricity consumer, to the anxiety related to remaining uranium stores, which would undoubtedly be exacerbated by increasing nuclear capacity, nuclear is rather obviously not the way to go. Even in the best-case scenario, it would be too little, too late. Geez, I almost forgot I was talking about a PragerU video. I haven't even mentioned Schellenberger's name in about 5 script pages, and that's because there really isn't that much to say. He spends the majority of time talking about how the dangers of nuclear are overemphasized, which we now know is a lie, and that the nuclear industry is apparently held back by pointless lawsuits. If you came to the PragerU video for a productive, informative piece about the suggestions for future energy policy, you undoubtedly must have come away disappointed. So what was the point? Why are we even here? Why would a propaganda outlet funded by petrochemical billionaires publish a piece advocating for a low-carbon energy source? And why did said piece focus on rehabilitating and defending the image of nuclear energy rather than discussing potential nuclear-centered climate policy? Well, we get hints throughout the video, but I think the real mask-off moment comes at the very last sentence. Let's take a listen.
If you want to save the planet, then you want to go nuclear. If you want to save the planet and you don't want to go nuclear, then you're just full of hot air.
If you want to save the planet and you don't want to go nuclear, then you're just full of hot air. This was never a call to action with the goal of saving the planet. This was never about climate change. This entire video was just a gotcha aimed at people who care about climate change but have reservations about nuclear energy. PragerU published the equivalent of a sarcastic Wonka meme. And just like that meme, the position advocated has aged like milk ever since people began floating the idea of a nuclear renaissance decades ago. As a matter of fact, if you care about climate change and you think the answer is to increase nuclear production, I'm afraid you're the one who needs to reconsider. Now, just to be 100% clear, I don't think nuclear is the answer for long-term energy policy, though I don't advocate the immediate closure of nuclear plants. Unless we radically change our energy policy here in the US, such immediate closure would undoubtedly increase CO2 emissions as new natural gas plants would open to fill the electricity demand. In fact, I pulled a little bit of a sneaky on you in the beginning when I cited the Japanese carbon emissions because annual emissions actually increased in the few years after Fukushima, peaking in 2013 at 1.31 billion tons, as more fossil fuels were burned after numerous nuclear plants were decommissioned. I also acknowledge that renewable sources of energy aren't perfect, but solar and wind are the best shot we have of lowering CO2 emissions, so they should definitely receive the lion's share of taxpayer money currently flushed down the toilet, keeping the dying nuclear industry afloat. We can also invest more in increasing energy efficiency to decrease the amount of total electricity we need to generate. On top of all that, electricity is just one part of the total sum of energy we currently use globally, and other goals need to be electrifying transportation and heating. There are also other carbon emission sources besides energy consumption, such as cattle ranching, which we'd seriously need to cut back. Climate change is perhaps one of the greatest threats we are currently facing as a species that we need to handle on many different fronts. If we're seriously lacking on any fronts because we're sticking with outdated, uneconomical, inefficient sources of electricity, the costs will be dire. And with that, thank you so much for watching. Go ahead and hit the like and subscribe and leave a nice comment if you want, and go for a walk, especially if you just watched this entire video in one sitting. I've got more content on the way, so stay tuned. Until next time, I've been exposed to way too much radiation and have probably got hours to live.